Final Fantasy has been evolving for decades, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much. From turn-based combat classics to full-on action games, each entry shakes up what we can expect. But with all these changes, has the series lost something? And more importantly, where does it go from here? Final Fantasy XVI fundamentally shifted the way a Final Fantasy story is delivered. Its fully action-based combat system abandoned party dynamics, turning what was once a more strategic RPG into a solo character action game. To be fair with 16, it wasn't the only one that changed the combat system this drastically. Final Fantasy 15 and arguably 12 also made a ton of changes to the formula, but 16's shift towards a complete action game is definitely a first in the series. I firmly believe that there's a reason why turn-based or party-driven systems work so well. It is of my belief that it enforces developers to create, whether they are conscious of it or not, a balanced and meaningful cast of members, where every character has a role in both gameplay and story. When a game is designed around a single protagonist, there is a tendency to leave the rest of the cast on the sideline. And if Final Fantasy wants to stay true to its roots, I believe it needs to bring back some sort of party dynamic system, even if the combat is more real-time, akin to, for example, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Obviously, a lot of people praise Final Fantasy VII Remake for its balance between action and strategy, and I have to admit that both Remake and Rebirth are games that I personally really enjoyed. Heck, I even cried in Rebirth. Yet I still hold reservations regarding this combat system. Call me old-fashioned, okay? But I'm one of those dudes that thinks like, if something works, why change what's not broken? And Final Fantasy's overall turn-based combat system has always worked. It had its problems, sure, but those problems were being addressed already, for example, with Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII, despite being considered by many one of the worst Final Fantasy mainline entry games, it did reinvent the approach of turn-based combat systems fairly well. The Paradigm Shift system, which is a system that allows players to switch roles of party members to adapt to different combat situations, creates a very interesting strategic depth, since it's a system that requires you to quickly assess situations and change accordingly. It actually went back to the active time battle system, making it potentially more engaging to people that enjoy a more fast-paced game, even though this system has always been a part of the series. And it also completely scrapped random encounters to a system where we can actually see the enemies on the map and we can decide to engage with them or not. Look, even with all of these great decisions, I do think unfortunately the combat system of 13 only really opens up on the late game, which was an incredibly poor decision. Character progression feels super linear without barely any decision making from the player across most of the chapters. And never in my mind would I thought to say this, but I do think the answer to a more balanced evolution of this franchise might just be in the approach of Final Fantasy XIII, and it could serve as a basis to evolve from there. I would also argue that there is a big difference when it comes to storytelling, especially from the golden age of Final Fantasy to the newest entries of Final Fantasy. Sure, Final Fantasy is all about a group of weirdos that band together and try to fix a major issue in the world. But it's not really only about that. This game is at its core a very Japanese game in its storytelling. In previous titles like Final Fantasy VI, 7, 8, 9, and 10, the themes of death, memory, existentialism, machines versus nature, and spirituality, these are central to the storytelling of these games. In my view, they provide a more deeper, philosophical layer to the narrative. Personally, I feel like the newer games, especially 15 and 16, do not really focus on these subjects. Or at the very least, their interpretation isn't as central or deeply explored as previous entries. To me, it feels like these themes are more sidelined in favor of other story elements like power and political struggles between kingdoms, which is fine, but I personally would hope to see more of those themes that I mentioned being more central to the plot and instead putting these power struggles a little bit to the sideline. Consistency is an issue that plagues this franchise. From 1987 all the way to 2002, we had a total of 11 mainline entry games, while in the last 5 years we only had 5 mainline entry games. And I know what you're probably going to say, like, yes, but, you know, in this time, games were very different, especially, you know, probably like these six, you know, they're 2D, they require a lot less, you know, computational power and a lot less time to develop these games, yada, yada. I totally get it. It still shows that these guys had a development cycle that was a lot more consistent than whatever they have now. And even if you check Final Fantasy 7 and 8, 9, 10, and 11, like the window of release of all of these 5 games is insanely low. Like it's like 5 to 6 years. It's crazy. And it's considered the golden age of the Final Fantasy franchise. I'm not saying that we should go back to this, but there's something there, you know, to explore. This era of Final Fantasy is a complete mess, if you ask me. They had this whole idea with Final Fantasy XIII of creating this whole universe called the Fabula Nova Crystallis, which was supposed to expand the world of Final Fantasy XIII into different video games, different sorts of media, and whatever. Final Fantasy XV was before called Final Fantasy Versus 13, and it was part of the universe of 13. But the problem is when Final Fantasy XIII released, it was viewed incredibly negative by both critics and players. And so my guess is that this whole idea of Fabula Nova Crystallis just went completely down the drain. This potentially caused, like, I don't know, man, a black hole when it comes to content for Final Fantasy mainline entry games because they didn't know what to do next. They had Versus 13 there to be made, so they decided to just, you know, slap the 15 logo on it and call it a new mainline entry game that honestly, I think Final Fantasy 15 has one of the best endings of any of the Final Fantasy games, but I think it did more harm than good to the franchise. It seems like Square Enix treats every new mainline entry Final Fantasy game as something that needs to be massive, a multi-million selling blockbuster game. But this has only led to long gaps, overblown budgets, and rising fan expectations that are impossible to meet at this point, especially on the AAA landscape that we live on right now. Final Fantasy XVI supposedly underperformed in sales. At least according to Matthew Ball, he has this whole presentation regarding the state of the video game industry in 2025. You can see it in this website. I'll link it down below. He has this specific graph which showcases to us all the games that cost more than 15 million bucks. And you can see here that Final Fantasy XVI supposedly, according to this dude, cost between $200 and $250 million. Instead of aiming for one perfect game every 6 to 8 years, why not embrace smaller scale entries that release a lot more consistently, potentially in a 3 or 4 year gap, which could be something to balance out the lack of new releases at this stage. Not every Final Fantasy needs to be a massive industry defining title. Smaller projects could absolutely lead up to a big one, keeping the series fresh without really exhausting the company or alienating fans. The two biggest examples of that right now in the industry are Larian Studios and From Software games. Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring were massive games, but these games emerged after years of developing smaller scale games that led up to these massive projects. And Miyazaki and Sven actually admitted that they could not keep up making these massive scale projects back to back. Instead, they take a smart, step-by-step approach, releasing smaller games between big ones, letting their team refine ideas while keeping the player base engaged. Atlas, the company behind games like Persona and the most recent Metaphor ReFantazio, is the direct competitor and example of a company that has both mastered a core formula that works really well for a specific audience, while constantly modernizing, adding new systems, and reinventing itself while staying true to its turn-based combat system. Square Enix, on the other hand, seems to keep going all in on these massive projects that take a decade to develop. They burn through resources like hell and leave long droughts between mainline entry games. And this creates another massive issue. Final Fantasy's relevancy is a shadow of its former self. What I'm about to say is speculation, but I bet that the majority of players that are in touch and enjoy Final Fantasy games belong to an older generation of players. It just makes sense in my head. If you have so many few releases, especially ones that simply did not have the reach and influence like games of the past, why would the newer generation even know about this franchise? Final Fantasy XIV, which is an MMO game, is really the only game at the moment that feels like it has an impact in the overall gaming landscape, culturally speaking. 14 even completely overshadows Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Remake. You know, obviously Google Trends alone is not a good metric, but I think it's a good starting point. I actually went in and I put all the big Final Fantasy games and how relevant they are. So I put it Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy VII Remake, 14, 15, and 16. And I'm sorry, but this is in Portuguese. But I've basically said in the last 12 months worldwide, which games are the most relevant ones. And the results are undeniable that Final Fantasy XIV on the yellow here is the most searched game on Google by far. Even when comparing directly Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to Final Fantasy XIV in the last 12 months, the answer is pretty in the nose which game is being more searched. But I think the biggest geek is this one right here. I decided to compare Final Fantasy with some of the biggest franchises, especially of like the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 era, which I would probably argue was probably the peak of when Final Fantasy was like really famous, because it was coming out of that golden age of Final Fantasy X, 9, 8, and 7. And so the data right now that we have, at least in Google Trends, is from 2004 all the way to now. And check the blue line that is representative of Final Fantasy. When compared to all of these franchises, blue line all the way to the top. But then what happens across the years? It goes all the way down, all the way to becoming somewhat as famous as all of these titles. Is Final Fantasy still relevant? Yes, but it's a complete shadow of its former self. Final Fantasy is at a crossroads right now. Square Enix cannot rely solely on Final Fantasy VII nostalgia bait or other previous Final Fantasy entries forever. The franchise desperately needs to embrace more consistent releases, smarter development cycles, a combat system that actually feels like a Final Fantasy game, and with a focus on storytelling and world building that has made some of these games so special to so many of us. I'm doing this video because I adore this franchise. I still cry every time I see the ending scene of Final Fantasy X. This franchise is very special to me, and I hope it's a franchise that finds its identity once again.
Goodbye.
Life passing me by, not thinking how the years have flown until I met you.